The soft hum of a standing fan did little to dispel the stifling heat of Jane's rented room. Scattered books and empty Roman packets painted the picture of a struggling university student. Jane had once carried big dreams that had made her the pride of her neighborhood. She had left home with hopes of earning a degree in business administration, but reality had slowly drained her optimism. Bills piled up relentlessly. Her landlord's warnings grew more aggressive, threatening eviction. Tuition fees were overdue, and her younger sister had just messaged, pleading for money to cover their father's hospital bills. One problem after another, a cycle with no end. She stared at the cracked mirror, her reflection weary and lost. Scrolling through her phone, she glanced at job listings, each rejection adding to her despair. Her bank balance blinked mockingly, $214. That evening, Jane sat alone in a cafe, sipping the only cup of coffee she could afford. A conversation at the next table caught her attention. 3 impeccably dressed young women, exuding confidence, whispered about a man named Mr. Douglas. "He pays well," one of them said, tapping her manicured nails on her phone. "I once got $1,000 just for spending the night." Desperation clouded Jane's judgment. She jotted down the name and number they mentioned, and later that night, she made the call. Mr. Douglas was everything the rumors described: intimidating, powerful, and dripping with wealth. He picked Jane up in a sleek black car, the leather seats cool against her skin. No small talk, no unnecessary explanations. They drove to his sprawling mansion on the outskirts of the city, a world far removed from her own. Over drinks in his lavish sitting room, he finally spoke. "I help people like you," he said, swirling his glass of whiskey. "But nothing comes for free. Are you willing to do whatever it takes?" Jane's throat tightened. She thought she was prepared, but something about his tone unsettled her. Still, images of her debts, her mother's frail figure in the hospital, and her landlord's threats propelled her forward. She nodded. Mr. Douglas leaned back, observing her. "There's a condition," he said. "Something unconventional." Her stomach twisted. "What kind of condition?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, enjoying her unease. "You spend the night with my dog, Polly." No questions asked. The words hit her like a slap. She blinked, convinced she had misheard. "Your dog?" Mr. Douglas didn't flinch. "You need money. This is the price." Jane sat frozen, her mind racing. She could walk away with her dignity intact, but that meant returning to the suffocating pressures of her financial burdens. Every logical part of her screamed to run, but desperation silenced the protest. "How much?" she finally whispered. $10,000. Cash. Tonight. The sum was staggering, enough to cover her tuition, rent, and hospital bills. Her hands trembled as she nodded. "Follow me," Mr. Douglas said, his expression unreadable. He led her down a dimly lit corridor to a room at the far end of the mansion. Inside, a large, well-groomed Doberman sat on a cushion. Its dark eyes were unreadable. Jane's stomach churned, but she forced herself to step inside. "You have 30 minutes, Mr. Douglas said before closing the door. Alone, the weight of her decision crushed her. Tears welled in her eyes, but she wiped them away. She couldn't afford weakness, not now. She needed the money. Her family needed her. The air in the room was thick with unbearable silence. The Doberman tilted its head, as if assessing her. A wave of shame so profound made her knees weak. "I can't do this," she whispered. But what choice did she have? She tried to focus on the reasons she had agreed, the debts, the helplessness in her brother's voice, the future slipping further out of reach. Slowly, she stepped forward, but nausea overtook her. She recoiled, stumbling back into the corner of the room, trembling violently. I can't do this," she choked out. The dog remained still, its calmness a stark contrast to her turmoil. The minutes ticked by. Mr. Douglas's voice echoed in her mind, 1 hour. She felt trapped, caged by her desperation and the impossible choice before her. But then, a thought struck her. What happens to me after? What happens to my soul? Her breath hitched. For the first time, she saw the Doberman not as a test of her desperation, but as a reflection of her own entrapment. Suddenly, the door opened. Mr. Douglas stepped inside, his smirk returning as his eyes scanned the untouched scene before him. "So, you're struggling," he said, amused. "Perhaps I overestimated you." Jane stood frozen. "It's a simple transaction," he continued. "You need money, I have it. No one will ever know. Isn't that what you want?" For a long moment, Jane remained silent. Then, finally, she exhaled. "No." His smirk faded. "Are you sure? Walk out now, and you get nothing. No second chances." Her body shook, but her resolve held firm. "I don't care. I'd rather face my problems than live with this for the rest of my life." Mr. Douglas studied her, then sighed and stepped aside. "Suit yourself." Jane hesitated, her legs weak as she walked past him and out of the room. She didn't look back. The cold night air hit her like a slap as she stepped outside. Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time in months, they weren't just tears of despair. They were tears of relief. She had no idea what awaited her, how she would face her landlord, her school, or her family. But she knew one thing, she still had herself. The heavy oak doors of the church creaked open as Jane stepped inside. The sanctuary silence wrapped around her like a blanket. She wasn't religious, but something had drawn her here. A priest knelt at the altar, deep in prayer. Gathering her courage, she approached. "Father," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I don't know what to do anymore." He turned, his gaze kind and unwavering. "Child, come forward." Jane sat beside him, her hands clenched in her lap. The words spilled out in a rush, the debts, the desperation, Mr. Douglas, and the unthinkable choice she had nearly made. Her body shook with every confession. "I almost did something I can never take back," she whispered. "I thought I could buy my freedom, but all it did was trap me more. How do I ask for forgiveness?" The priest rested a gentle hand on hers. "You are not defined by your mistakes. Desperation leads us down dark paths, but it does not make you evil. Forgiveness comes from the heart, not from perfection." Tears streamed down Jane's face as the weight of her choices settled over her. "I don't know how to start over," she admitted. The priest smiled. "One step at a time, my child. That's all it takes." For the first time in a long while, Jane felt a flicker of hope. She had no clear answers, no immediate solutions, but she had something far more valuable, the belief that she could still find redemption.